This video is about how to paint a variety of trees using watercolor. In watercolor, when we paint trees, we're more capturing the texture and idea of the tree rather than a photographic likeness. This image shows the nice detail that you can get for trees in the foreground of your image. Notice that you can see a lot of the details of the leaves and a wider variety of different colors and shadows. In this image, the trees are more in the middle ground and you can see some variety of the shadows, but not as much detail. And in this image, you can see that the trees are in the background, so you can really just see the overall shape and texture to see that they are trees, but since they're further away, you don't get to see a lot of the detail. And finally, in this image, you can see some of the trees on the left in the middle ground and then the background trees on the right. For the demonstration, we're going to go over both your typical trees and evergreen trees. When we talk about painting watercolor trees, what I don't want is these sort of outlines of Christmas trees, which is definitely tempting to do if that's what you're used to drawing. So what we're going to look at is how to get different textures and values and the ideas of trees without just the outline of them. The first thing to think about with your trees is where they are in your picture. So if they're going to be in the background, you can see in this example that they're just going to be sort of these blob shapes. Really general shapes, you're not going to see a lot of detail. And then the closer they get to you, the more you're going to see individual trees, the more you're going to see individual branches and all of the different values and color variations. You're going to be able to see them a little bit more clearly as they come toward the foreground. They're also going to get a little bit larger as they get toward the viewer and a little bit closer to that viewer. The size brushes that I use to paint my watercolor trees vary depending on how large of trees I'm working with, but in general I use a small pointed watercolor brush and a medium size acrylic flat brush. For this demo, I have pre-mixed the colors on my palette. So I have a lighter sort of evergreen, which is my sap green mixed with some burnt sienna. And then I have a darker green, and I'm going to use the darker green for my foreground and the lighter green for my background. The first tree I'm going to show is an evergreen tree using a flat brush. I'm going to start off with my lighter value, and I'm going to use the side of my flat brush to create the trunk of the tree, and I'm going to trail it off and taper it as I get toward the top. From there, I'm going to reload my brush and continue with that flat brush, and I'm going to make it dance along the paper. So I'm picking it up and putting it down a little bit like stippling, and I'm going to tip it to the side, and I'm going to keep doing that to kind of build up the first layer of that tree. This technique helps you to get a little bit more of an organic shape to your tree. Since trees have, especially in nature, have bare spots, you're not going to just make it a perfect Christmas tree. You're going to have it be a little bit asymmetrical and dance it around the paper. If your tree is in the middle ground or the foreground, you're going to want to pay attention to where the shadows land, and you can go in with that darker value of green and start to put in on the side where the sunlight is not hitting the tree, where those shadows would be. You're going to start using the same technique but with your darker green, and you're going to add in those shadows. And then you can also use a little bit of yellow to add in the highlights on the areas where the sun hits first. So this is what your tree will look like at the end. The next type of tree is going to be your deciduous trees, or I call them tree trees. These are your regular trees with trunks and branches and the leaves that actually fall. For this tree, I'm going to use my flat brush to start creating and forming the trunk of the tree. With that trunk of the tree, I'm going to use my flat brush to create some texture. It's going to get wider to account for the root system at the bottom. And then I'm also going to start kind of feathering in my wider branches. This is going to be mostly if your tree is in the foreground. As I'm painting, I'm paying attention to the branches and the location that they're coming out. So branches don't just come out of each side. You have to have them come out of the middle area and give it some variety, which will make it more interesting and also seem more lifelike. You'll work your way up until you reach the area where the leaves start to take over, and then you really don't have to put the rest of the details in there because the leaves will cover up any of those branch details. Once I have the general shape in there, I can start to pay attention to where the light is hitting and add some of my darker values where there is less light and some of my lighter values where there's going to be more light. I can also go through and add a little bit of water to my brush, and that will help to fuzzy the color, and I can use this time to add texture. So you can see that I'm adding in some of the bark for the tree and some of that bark texture. This would especially be if these sort of trees are in your foreground and you see them first. Once I finish this part of my tree, I'm going to let it dry and move on to adding all of the leaves onto my tree. So I'm switching over to an already dry piece. I'm going to start with my lighter colors, and I'm going to just start stippling and dancing those leaves in. You're going to notice that I'm using my small, softer watercolor brush. This is going to help create the illusion of leaves. I'm not drawing every single leaf in. I'm more mimicking the shape and the form of that tree and trying to get all the different leaves in. I'm also paying attention to the color variations and the value in the tree as I go along.